Hello and welcome to Better Than Art School. This is a mini lecture on patterns and grids. So if you've seen my other composition mini lectures, we've talked about how composition comes from playing opposites off against each other. Okay, so the main pair that we did a couple different pairs, for heaven's sake. Anyway, basically unity is order, variety is chaos, and when you combine them, then you get a composition. So you need two things that are opposed to each other, and you need to successfully balance them to create a composition, to create an interesting composition. And so the composition is a combination of multiple parts into a unified whole. Okay, so arguably you need that kind of meshing or that kind of opposition to create a composition. So when we talk about grids and we talk about patterns, what we're talking about are ideas of something that's kind of on the outer boundary of what a composition is. So some grids you could say are definitely a composition, some patterns you could say are definitely compositions, and some are harder to put into that camp, and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so they live on the outer edge of composition because arguably a pattern or a grid can be too much unity and not enough variety. So say you have something that's just a wallpaper and it goes on forever, and where you put the rectangle around it doesn't really matter. You could put it anywhere. And that starts to feel like it's not really a composition at all. It feels like it's just a wallpaper. It feels like it's just something that's repeating. Like this one, for instance. This is kind of a pattern, and it really doesn't matter where you frame it. You could frame it here, you could frame it wider, get more of it in. But basically the thing about this is that the way that you crop it is sort of arbitrary in a way, because it's just this thing that goes on forever. And a pattern is a visual element, it's a module, it's a shape, and it's repeated over an extended area. Okay, and so patterns are everywhere. So everywhere you look, you'll see patterns. It's any time that you have something that repeats. So water, in this case, the light hitting the water creates a pattern. And a pattern is based on a module. So when humans are designing a pattern, what they do is they start with a module, and it can be floral based, like some of these are, or whatever it is. It can be based on something in nature or not, and then you just repeat it indefinitely, and that creates a pattern. Okay, so patterns are flat. They're on the XY axis. They're not on the Z axis that goes inside of the graph. They go up, they go across, but they don't go in. Okay, they don't get bigger and smaller based on a perspectival understanding of space. They might get bigger and smaller in a fractal way, which I'll talk about in a second, but they usually it stays on a flat field. Okay, both grids and patterns are like that. And when you start looking for patterns, you'll see them everywhere. And one way to make a pattern that people tend to like is by following a fractal kind of idea. So a fractal is just a pattern or a shape that's the same regardless of how close up you get. So in a fractal, you can come really close up on something and it looks the same as if you pull the camera way back. So regardless of the level of resolution, it looks the same pretty much. That's what it means. And so if you can base a pattern on that idea. So a second ago I said that patterns don't get larger or smaller based on perspective, but they might get larger or smaller based on a fractal kind of idea, where you get a small version of it here and you get a large version of it here, something like that. So humans love fractals. We love stuff like that. We love variations on a theme. We like to see rhythm. That's why music repeats the same parts over and over again and changes them slightly as the song goes. We love variations on a theme. That's just something people love. Okay, so this is a case where this is a composition because the way it's cropped is definitely part of the image. There is unity and variety here. But if you took the fish out and it was just this wallpaper idea, that I would say isn't quite a composition. It's a wallpaper, it's a pattern, but it doesn't, where you crop it doesn't really matter. But this is an example of how you can set a baseline or you can set a default and then put another image on top of it. This is another example of that. So this is Gustav Klimt, and in this case, this pattern kind of sets up something and then he paints a semi-realistic kind of portrait into it. Some patterns can look like videos or GIFs or whatever, GIFs, but it's just because your eye's doing saccades around, so it becomes an optical illusion. All right, and then, so patterns are everywhere and around the world in art and architecture. You'll see it over and over again in the way that quilts are made and the way that buildings are constructed. You'll see it just anywhere you go. Just look for patterns, and I promise you'll see them all around the world. So every place that you go in the world, people employ patterns in their designs. It's very, very common. Something you might not realize has a pattern, and you look on top and, oh yeah, there's a little pattern going around here. So this is a quote by Isaiah Berlin. It says, "To understand is to perceive patterns." And that's one of my favorite things about getting old, actually, is that when you're young, you just see object, object, event, event, and you're constantly thrown off guard by events. And as you get older, you realize things kind of keep happening in a new guise. So it's a variation on a theme idea again, but you see this underlying pattern underneath everything. And when you experience a new situation, maybe it seems anxiety producing, you realize it's really just similar to something you experienced before, but it just had a different cadence to it, or different guise to it, or a different way it presents itself. But it's there's the same underlying pattern underneath both events. All right, so now grid. So that was a little bit about pattern. So if you notice, patterns are based on shape. So most patterns, it's a shape repeating, it's the module repeating. A grid is based on line. So back to our formal ideas, so line, value, shape, color, space, texture, all those are formal ideas. And patterns are more about shape, grid are more about intersecting lines. And of course, cities are all based on a grid. Modern cities, even ancient cities, are based on a grid. This is how people plan out, how is the sewage system going to work, how are the sidewalks and the streets and all this kind of stuff. And the different grids have to do with the topography of the land that they're built on, and maybe ideas that the architects had or the city planners had. All right. So in both cases, remember, a pattern is based on a module that just repeats. A grid is based on a structural pattern that builds up larger, or that repeats as well. Okay, so grids don't have to be rectilinear. They could also be curvilinear. So like in the case of a beehive, a honeycomb of the bees, this is a grid. It's just kind of in little octagon shapes. All right, and in nature, what grids do is they add structural reinforcement, okay? They build on each other, and it makes the structure stronger, right? Okay, so like I was saying earlier about patterns, grids are flat. They're based on the XY axis. They're not on the Z axis. They don't go into space, okay? That would be called a matrix or something like that, where if it goes into space, or if it's three-dimensional, it's more of a structure. It's more of a matrix than a grid. Okay, so this is Mondrian, famous artist who used grids a lot. This is kind of a more fine art. These are fine art pieces, so they are composed. They're using grids within a composition. So remember I said compositions are variety and unity, and where you crop it matters. So some grids would fall into that compositional idea, and some patterns would fall into the compositional idea, and then some don't. Some just are just a wallpaper. So these are examples of grids that are actually compositions. And this is Mondrian getting used in fashion. Andy Warhol, these are these patterns because of the shape that repeats, or are they grids because they're organized by intersecting lines? And I would say these are kind of in between. It's like these are the hard cases. This is Damien Hirst, the same idea. It's organized through intersecting lines, but the actual repeating thing is a shape. So it's kind of a pattern within a grid, or a grid within a pattern, however you want to see it. And there's a little puppy, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.